Welcome to this depth dive. Today we are opening up the text of 1 John chapter 1, and we're zeroing in specifically on verses 1 through 5.
Right.
And our mission for this deep dive is to solve one of the heaviest homiletic burdens you face as an expositor. I mean, you step into the pulpit Sunday after Sunday, and you look out at a congregation that is just bombarded by the abstract.
Oh, totally.
We live in this age of hyper-intellectualized, highly skeptical faith. And quite frankly, the modern church often treats the incarnation as a philosophical concept.
Like a neat theological category in a systematic textbook.
Exactly. It's a high-minded doctrine. What they do not naturally do is treat it as a bodily, historical invasion that just completely shatters human history. So the pastoral struggle is unrelenting, How do you, as an expository preacher, make the sheer, tangible reality of the incarnation hit your congregation with immediate, undeniable force?
Yeah.
How do you move them from this passive intellectual assent to a visceral, spatial confrontation with the word of life?
Well, and that specific homiletic burden is exactly why we need to rigorously examine the macro discourse of 1 John chapter 1, verses 1 through 5.
Yeah.
Because when you look at the architecture of this text in the original Koine Greek, it really is a structural masterpiece.
It is.
It functions as a single complex periodic structure serving as the epistle's macroexordium.
Right.
So for this deep dive, we are dropping directly into that Koine Greek text.
Right.
And we will be operating exclusively within the systemic functional linguistics framework. We're going to deploy the ideational and textual meta-functions directly, and we are combining that strictly with Constantine Campbell's spatial aspect model.
Okay, yes.
Our goal is to trace exactly how John manipulates grammatical space.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how he uses proximity and remoteness
Yeah.
to pull the reader out of their abstract theology and right into direct apostolic fellowship.
And what is so fascinating about this is that the overarching structural anomaly just hits you the second you look at the text.
Oh, yeah, it's immediate.
John does something incredibly jarring here. You have this massive front-loading of R1 relative reference clauses, ho and ho, akikomen, ho herakamen.
Right, he just stacks them.
He deliberately suspends the main verbal predicate all the way until verse 1-3b. Think about that from a communicative standpoint. He is forcing the audience to hold their breath, stacking relative clause upon relative clause, building this immense structural tension before he finally gives you the main verb.
It creates an intense thematic density, and he is forcing you into a prolonged state of focal attention. So let's start the spatial zoom and walk through the aspectual peaks sequentially, clause unit by clause unit, beginning right at 101A.
Let's do it.
Okay, so we have homonop arches. In the ideational metafunction, we parse this as a relational, specifically stative process. The verbal element is N.
Right.
And this imperfect tense form encodes imperfective aspect and remoteness, acting as the spatial and discursive background. It is the wide-angle establishing shot of the entire epistle.
And, the homiletic payoff of that specific imperfective remoteness is absolute grounding.
Exactly.
When you are preaching 1A, you are establishing the eternal, unshakable foundation before time even began. You are giving the congregation the absolute theological bedrock.
Yeah.
Think about the spatial metaphor there. The imperfective remoteness of incoron is like this continuous, low drone note operating beneath a symphony. It is the vast, unending spatial background of eternity. So before John gives you the sudden, jarring reality of the incarnation, he forces you to stare into the remote depths of what always was.
Which is absolutely necessary for the sudden spatial shift we see next. I mean, without that background remoteness, the foreground has no impact.
That's just a vacuum.
Exactly.
Vacuum.
So moving to 1B, ho kakomen, and 1C, ho hirakamen toa ophthalmoa lusa.
Okay.
We shift immediately into mental and perception processes. The censor here is the apostolic collective. And notice the radical especial shift to the perfect tense forms, akikomen and hirakamen.
Wow.
In Campbell's spatial paradigm, this is heightened proximity. This is a deliberate, violent, spatial zoom-in. John is dragging the apostolic sensory experience right up to the reader's face. He's utilizing explicit anatomical instruments in the goal and means, like toi ophthalmo hamon, to force the issue.
And that is the tangible witness you must replicate in the pulpit. You cannot just read those perfect tense forms as mere historical data.
No, you can't.
Preaching must drag the historic reality of Christ into the present pew. You cannot leave the incarnation in the theoretical ether. The heightened proximity demands that the congregation feels the heat of the apostolic gaze.
Right.
If Campbell's model tells us the perfect tense form is about pulling the action into the immediate foreground, then your sermon must do exactly that. When John says, which we have heard, and which we have seen with our eyes, he is violently pulling the congregation out of the abstract and forcing them to stare at a physical body.
Exactly. The spatial zoom-in is unmistakable. But then we hit 1 by D, ho etiasemitha, and 1 AK high, chairs hemon, ipsilaphoson peritu logutizos.
Okay, let's look at that.
We are still operating in mental and perception processes in 1D, but we cross over into a material and action process in 1E. The actor is he shares hemon. Our hands, handled.
Right, explicit physical action.
But notice the verbal aspect here. The aspect shifts to the aorist tense forms, ephiasemitha and ipsilaphizon. So we are dropping back to perfective, aspect, and remoteness.
Wait, hold on. I need to push back on this. You are losing me here, and frankly, I think you were going to lose the working pastor on this one.
Okay, why is that?
Well, if John's entire homiletic goal in this macro exordium is immediate relevance, if he is trying to bring the congregation into the text to establish the vivid physical reality of the word of life, why on earth does he downshift to aorist perfective remoteness right here?
Ah, I see what you're saying.
I mean, you just said the perfect tense forms in 1B and C pull us into heightened proximity, so why throw it in reverse? Doesn't the external viewpoint, that helicopter view of the aorist, distance the listener right at the exact moment you want them closest? It feels like pedagogical whiplash.
Well, it does feel like whiplash if you're only thinking linearly. But we have to look at how Campbell's spatial framework governs discourse generation as a whole.
Okay.
The aorist tense form provides the mainline narrative backbone. The perfects act as the zoom lens, absolutely, producing that heightened proximity we just discussed. But the aorists provide the unalterable summary historical baseline.
The bedrock.
Right, think about the cinematography of the text. Without the external perfective viewpoint of the aorist to establish the event as an objective, holistic historical reality, the perfects have no historical bedrock to zoom in on.
I see.
The aorist anchors the sensory data in objective history, so the perfect can bring its abiding reality into the present spatial proximity. So John drops into the aorist for ethiosemitha and ipsilaphoson to say, look, this is not a subjective internal feeling. This is a closed, objective, remote historical fact.
Okay, wow. That makes incredible sense for the expositor. Because the aorist remoteness proves it wasn't a subjective hallucination. It was an external, concrete event that happened in objective space and time. And that actually fuels the homiletic weight of the perfect forms.
Precisely.
It gives you the pastoral authority to stand up and say, this happened in absolute history, and its reality is sitting right here, right now in this room. You are using the aorist to lock the anchor into the bedrock and the perfect to pull the chain tight.
Yes. And that perfective baseline, that historical anchor, continues directly into 1-2 Kai Hizoya Feneroth. We have a material event process with an aorist passive indicative introduced by an external additive conjunction, Kai.
Right.
The actor, or rather the phenomenon being acted upon, is Hizoe, which picks up the L4 domain cluster from the very end of 1 sos.
Life itself invaded time. That is your homiletic payoff for 1-2 right there.
Absolutely.
The personification of life being externally manifested. When you preach that aorist passive, ephanereth, you are preaching the ultimate intrusion. That eternal spatial background of in verse 1 suddenly rips into the perfective remoteness of human history. Life was manifested.
Right, and then the textual structure cascades rapidly from 1-2b to 1-2d. Kai horakamen, kai markrumen, kai apangelmen, hymen, ten zon, ten ionian.
Which is just a brilliant sequence.
It is. We see a highly specific L5 lexical chain here, moving through sensory and proclamation verbs. Clause 1-2b returns to the heightened proximity with the perfect form, hiorakamen, we have seen.
Right.
But then 1-2c and 1-2d shift decisively to verbal and proclamation processes using present tense forms, martyrumen and apangelamen. This establishes imperfective proximity.
And that maps perfectly to the pastoral mandate. Just look at the progression you just laid out. You are transitioning the congregation from internal focal observation, the heightened proximity of having seen an outward authoritative present ministry, because the present tense forms of imperfective proximity demand that the church doesn't just passively observe the incarnation. They must actively testify and proclaim it in their immediate spatial context.
Exactly.
The spatial proximity of those present tense forms means the proclamation is happening right now in the immediate foreground of the discourse. You are preaching a present living reality.
Exactly. Now, the proclamation chain is structurally interrupted, however, by a theological framing in 1-2e and 1-2f.
Okay, let's break that down.
In 1-2e, we have hetus ompro ton patera. This is a relational state of process. The relative pronoun hetus points back to the eternal life. The verbal element is N, returning again to imperfective remoteness.
Okay.
And this is followed immediately in 1-2F by Kai Ephaneroth Hemen, a material event process utilizing aorist perfective remoteness once again.
Wait, hang on. I need to challenge you on this parsing of 1-2E. You are identifying the N here as imperfect remoteness. But if the entire goal of this prologue, which, we are going to see explicitly in verse 3, is horizontal and vertical koinonia, true fellowship, why use an imperfective remoteness to describe Christ's relationship with the Father?
That's a fair question.
Doesn't assigning remoteness to the divine fellowship geographically and theologically isolate it from our spatial proximity? If I tell my congregation that the fellowship between the Father and the Son exists in a state of remoteness, well, haven't I just pushed the Trinity completely out of the room?
It absolutely seems counterintuitive until you analyze the discursive setting of the clause.
Okay, break it down for me.
The imperfect N here is an internal viewpoint, yes, but it is set at a deliberate spatial distance to bracket the incarnation. It portrays a continuous unrolled existence of the Word in eternity past to give the necessary theological grounding to the sudden aorist external event that follows in 1-2F.
Right, so the backgrounding again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The remoteness doesn't isolate the fellowship, it elevates its origin. It demonstrates that the life that manifested perfectly in human history originates from a spatial and temporal infinity entirely outside of it. John requires that remote background to highlight the sheer shock of the perfective foregrounding.
Oh, wow.
Think of it like a lightning strike. You cannot perceive the violent, immediate proximity of the lightning without the vast, remote, dark background of the storm clouds. The imperfect remoteness of 1-2E is the storm cloud. The aorist ephenereth in 1-2S is the lightning.
That is a phenomenal way to preach it. The remoteness of the Father and Son's eternal communion isn't an absence. It is the absolute sheer scale of the reality that suddenly localized itself in a human body.
Right.
That perfectly sets up the textual frontiers and cohesive chains we encounter next, because the suspense of that front-loaded structure we talked about at the beginning, it's reaching its absolute breaking point here.
It truly is. Let's walk through 1-3A to 1-5E and watch this resolve.
Yeah.
In 1-3A, we see the resumptive object fronting. Ho hiora kamen. Kayakekoamen.
Right, picking up the thread.
Exactly. It picks up the suspended relative chain from verse 1. We are back in mental perception processes with perfect heightened proximity, summarizing the focal peak of the entire exordium. John is reminding the reader of the spatial zoom-in before he delivers the main verb.
And then finally, in 1-3B, the massive front-loaded structural suspension resolves. Apangelamin kaihimin.
Exactly. We finally hit the main matrix verb of the entire periodic structure. A pangelamin is a verbal proclamation process operating in present imperfective proximity.
And for the expositor, the homiletic suspense breaks right here. This is the moment the wave crashes on the shore. John brings the massive weight of eternal life, the historical perfective reality of the manifestation, the heightened proximity of the apostolic witness, and he drops all of it squarely on the audience with that inclusive invitation to you also. The present imperfective proximity demands an active present tense response from the church. This is an ancient history, This isn't a museum exhibit. This is an immediate spatial confrontation. You are pulling the congregation into the exact same spatial proximity as the apostles.
And that confrontation is entirely governed by a purpose clause in 1-3C. Hinakai, himas, koinonian, eshite, methema.
Right, the Hina clause.
The internal causal and purpose conjunction, hina, drives a relational possessive process using the present subjunctive, eshite.
The homiletic payoff there is the definition of preaching itself. I mean, the goal of all true expository preaching is koinonia.
Absolutely.
It is not mere data transfer. It is not just making sure your congregation has orthodox systematic theology. It is fellowship. You have to point out to your congregation the parallel metaphrases here. You have the horizontal link first in 1-3C with us, the church, the apostolic tradition.
Which immediately links to the vertical in 1-3D. Kai hi koinonia te he metatra metotu patros kai metatu huo autu Jesu Christu. Here we have an escalating internal conjunction kaidi with a relational stative implied verb. The textual metafunction here is binding the horizontal and vertical together inextricably.
You cannot have the horizontal koinonia without the vertical and vice versa.
Right.
The parallel prepositional structures create a unified relational network. True preaching pulls the congregation into that specific network. You are telling them the fellowship you have with the person sitting next to you in the pew is fundamentally wired into the eternal fellowship of the Father and the Son.
And this brings us to a distinct textual shift in 1.4a kai tauta graphomen hemis. We transition here to a material action process. The verbal element is graphomen, operating in present proximity. Notice the marked fronted object, tauta.
Ah, the shift to written, textual authority. The oral proclamation transitions to an unalterable text. We write these things.
And that textual action is driven by another purpose clause. In 1.4b, haina hichea hemane peploromne. This is a relational attributive process within a subordinate periphrastic clause.
Okay.
The verbal element couples the present subjunctive e with the perfect passive participle peploromene. And this participle functions as an aspectual peak and a spatial zoom-in.
Stop right there.
Oh.
I absolutely need you to defend this parsing. I cannot preach a grammatical error, and that feels like one.
How so?
Well, you are classifying a perfect participle, peploromene, inside a haina purpose clause as an aspectual peak and a spatial zoom-in. But this action hasn't even happened yet.
Right.
It is a desired ideal that our joy may be full. It is inherently unresolved, right? It is future potential. So how in the world can you classify it as a spatial zoom-in if it's just a wish?
Yeah.
That is like trying to film a close-up of a ghost. How can John zoom in on something that hasn't even actualized?
Well, it requires fully understanding the intersection of SFL and Campbell's model, and frankly, abandoning our temporal bias entirely.
Okay, explain that.
The relational attributive process limits the action to a state of being. Remember, Campbell's heightened proximity is not about time. We reject temporal definitions entirely here.
Right. No past action with present result.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It is not about that. It is entirely about spatial framing. John is pulling this state of complete joy right up to the camera lens. He doesn't view it as a distant future reality, which would require an entirely different grammatical construction, perhaps a future indicative.
Oh, I see.
By using the perfect passive participle peperomene in this periphrastic construction, he encodes it as a vivid, palpable presence within the fellowship right now. The spatial zoom-in makes the fullness of joy an immediate, tangible attribute of the koinonia, not a deferred, eschatological promise.
Wow. That is a massive paradigm shift for pastoral counseling and the pulpit.
Engages everything.
You don't preach joy as some far-off pie-in-the-sky promise. You urge the congregation toward abiding joy right now in the present spatial reality of their fellowship. You are telling the congregation that joy is the oxygen in the room right now. You preach it as an immediate attribute of the text. Because John brings it into heightened proximity, the pastor has the authority to demand that joy be a present reality in the life of the church.
And that leads directly into a major cohesive boundary shift at 1.5a, kai esten hote hi angelia. We transition from C1 to R2, cohesive elements. This is a relational identifying process with the present proximity verb esten.
The shift from the relational process to the core dogma. The pastoral tone in the pulpit must shift right here. You've brought them into fellowship, you've established the joy, and now the apostolic tradition is locked in. You are moving into the unyielding truth claims.
Yes, and in 1.5b, and akikomen apo 2, we see a relative clause dropping back into perfect heightened proximity with akikomen. The sensory witness is reaffirmed before the actual content of the message is delivered.
Because the authority to declare the dogma comes entirely from the heightened proximity of having heard it directly from the source.
Plus, I feel.
The preacher's authority isn't their own cleverness, it is the apostolic witness.
Which triggers 1.5c, kai anangelimen hymen, a verbal proclamation process in present proximity, leading to the content complement clause in 1.5d, hoti ho theosos phos estin.
Right.
This is a relational attributive process, also in present proximity, where the internal explicative conjunction hoti unpacks the divine message.
And the homiletic payoff for 1.5d is the absolute, non-negotiable thesis of the passage. God equates to light, absolute purity.
Yeah.
The high interpersonal modality in these indicatives of stance demands a sermon tone of absolute certainty. There is no room for equivocation, no room for nuance in your delivery here. When you preach God is light, it must land with the weight of an anvil.
And that lack of equivocation is structurally codified in 1.5e kai scotia and auto istin udemia. This is a relational existential process.
Okay.
But look closely at the textual metafunction. We have a marked fronted antonym, scotia, combined with a double negative, uti udemia, all operating in present proximity.
Zero tolerance for darkness. The double negative is a dogmatic boundary emphasizing the total exclusion of sin from God's proximity. Right.
If God is present proximity light, then darkness has absolute zero existence within that space. You have to preach the sheer incompatibility of the two.
Exactly. So now that we have rigorously mapped the ideational processes, the textual frontiers, and the spatial-spectral peaks clause by clause, we need to transition into the homiletic and pastoral translation.
Yes, let's synthesize this. Let's formulate the big idea live on air right now. We'll merge the primary SFL process types, moving from physical perception to relational fellowship with the aspectual peaks we've identified.
Okay, let's do it.
So taking the structural suspension of the exordium, the heightened proximity of the sensory perfects, and the relational domains of the Heine clauses, the big idea for the expositor is this. The eternal life and divine light revealed in Jesus Christ have been tangibly witnessed and brought into heightened proximity by the apostles, so that you may enter into relational koinonia with God and experience the peak reality of complete joy. That big idea bridges the ancient interpersonal stance directly to the modern application. It utilizes the proximity forms for immediate daily life application in the believer's life.
Absolutely. So let's build the expository sermon outline directly from the text marked from themes and structural breaks. If you are preaching this on Sunday, we will title the sermon Tangible Truth, Absolute Light. Point 1 derives directly from the marked fronting of the relative clauses and the aorist baseline forms we see in verses 1 and 2. Point 1 is the historical reality of the word of life.
And from a linguistic standpoint, point 1 rests heavily on the fronted relative pronouns ho and the perfective remoteness of ethazmitha, epsilaphoson, and iphanerif, the aorist anchors.
And the pastoral application for point 1 is to outright reject modern skepticism and Gnosticism. You must ground the congregation in the bodily, historical reality of Christ. If you leave Christ in the realm of abstract ideas, you have completely failed the text's baseline historical framing.
Right.
You use the aorist remoteness to say, this happened, it is unalterable. Now, point 2 draws from the Heine conjunctions and the koinonia cohesive chain in verses 3 and 4. Point 2 is the relational goal of proclamation.
This point is driven by the internal causal and purpose conjunctions connecting the verbal proclamation processes to the relational possessive processes. It culminates, exactly as we debated, in the relational attributive process of 1,4b with the aspectual peak of the perfect passive participle pepperomony.
And the application for point 2 is ensuring your congregation understands that preaching isn't data transfer, it's an invitation to cosmic fellowship.
Yep.
You utilize that 1,4b perfect participle, zoom in to urge the congregation toward abiding complete joy right now. You are inviting them into the parallel metaphrases, the horizontal and vertical network of grace. You are moving them from historical observers to active participants in the fellowship of the Trinity.
Okay, beautiful.
Finally, point 3 derives from the marked boundary shift at 1,5a and the extreme marked negative fronting of 1,5e. Point 3 is the divine character driving the message.
All right, and point 3 hinges on the C1 to R2 cohesive shift at Kaya Steinhout Anglavia and the relational existential absolute denial in Scotia and auto Augustinodemia. The marked fronting of darkness absolutely demands attention.
The application here is establishing the absolute purity of God. The strong indicatives of stance mean the pulpit cannot compromise on the utter incompatibility of God and moral darkness. You must preach the absolute nature of God with the same unyielding certainty that the Koine Greek syntax demands. You cannot soften the blow of that double negative.
And when you combine the SFL metafunctions with Campbell's spatial axis, the text refuses to let the reader remain a passive, distant observer. The architecture of the Greek literally forces proximity.
Which leaves you with a final provocative challenge as you prepare to step into the pulpit this Sunday. Based on this granular SFL and aspectual analysis, Lohanian theology is defined by its spatial immediacy. So ask yourself, Pastor, if your preaching keeps Christ solely in the aorist remoteness of history and fails to utilize the perfect spatial zoom-in of immediate, tangible fellowship, well, are you even preaching the true gospel of 1 John?
Wow.
Look at your sermon verbs this week. Look at your manuscript. Are you merely reporting on a remote event, or are you dragging eternal life right up to the front row?